you set out for Ithaca, hope that your journey is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. Lystragonians and Cyclops, angry Poseidon, do not be afraid of them. You'll never find things like that on your way, as long as you keep your thoughts raised high, as long as a rare sensation touches your spirit and your body.
Why do they insist on remembering us as old men? The profile frowning on the plaque, the statue standing regally in the park, almost inevitably depicts the vanished hero as time-worn, if undaunted, the slightly battered survivor of his own remarkable life. If you're famous and deceased, the world that lives after seems to believe you were old all your life. So let's pass for tonight on the aging, mournful Cavafy, holding court in his apartment full of knickknacks, the Cavafy with the plain and somber elderly face, the Cavafy who pined so lyrically for the stolid, careless young men to whom Cavafy himself, a great spirit, a sizzling and immaculate soul, might just as well have been part of the chair in which he sat. For tonight, let's have Cavafy, when he himself was the young man who, decades later, he'd come to so ardently desire. Let's have him strolling near the Roman baths in Alexandria on a bright, warm afternoon. Let's give him a determined stride and supple hips. Let's furnish him with the intense, finely drawn face he wore in his 20s. It's not a handsome face, but it's compelling, sexy in a stern and circumspect way. Let's focus on his moist, mocha-colored eyes and his smallish mouth, all but hidden by his black mustache. A shy mouth, a mouth that could conceivably be cajoled into being fed grapes, one by one, if you got him alone in the right room. There's something sexy about a serious young man, about what he suggests regarding the possibility of his own undoing. Let's send him, hurried and businesslike, past a certain cafe, where an old man sits hunched over his coffee. The old man, watching the young Cavafy pass, is stricken by a strange tumble of feelings. There is, of course, lust. First, as Cavafy approaches the intent, dark-eyed face with its precocious aspect of gravitas. And then, after Cavafy has walked on, the tapering back and the melony buttocks moving gracefully under the gray serge of his trousers. For the old man, there is, as well as desire, the lift of having briefly witnessed Cavafy's beauty, combined with the loneliness Cavafy leaves in his wake. A magical being has passed by. A sober young man, heartbreakingly unaware of his own grace. And now there's just the street again, with its cigarette butts and its wind-rattled newspaper. This old man, who is not a poet, who, when he dies, will leave nothing but a few hundred Egyptian pounds and an apartment full of brown furniture, takes the last sip of his lukewarm coffee as young Cavafy turns a corner and disappears forever. Cavafy, our Cavafy, this young Cavafy, right now, continues along, unaware of the fact that he's briefly been another man's ardent, thwarted dream. Our Cavafy, this Cavafy, has business to attend to. He has the day ahead of him. He has his life of errands and assignations, of ambitions and anticipation. It'll still be many years before he takes his own place in that chair at that table. Thank you.
The streets go, the houses go, the lights go, it fades and disappears.
Σαν σώματα ωραία, νεκρών που δεν εγέρασαν ποτέ. Και τα κλείσαν με δάκρυα σε μαυσολείο λαμπρό, με ρόδα στο κεφάλι και γιασεμιά στα πόδια. Έτσι οι επιθυμίες μοιάζουν που πέρασαν χωρίς να εκπληρωθούν, χωρίς να αξιωθεί καμιά της ειδονής νύχτα ή κανένα φεγγερό της πρωινό.
Something very extraordinary happens. These are the words of George Seferis, another great Greek poet, referring in the year 1946 to Constantine Cavafy, or rather, referring to the remarkable transformation in Cavafy's poetry that took place during a crucial period in his development, from the last decade of the 19th century to the first decade of the 20th. In the 1890s, Cavafy was publishing in journals and literary magazines flowery Belle Époque verse that Seferis rightly described as, quote, ordinary and lacking in any great distinction. 10 years later, he had stopped publishing altogether and, more to the point, had begun to write his greatest poems. If you love Cavafy, the great question is this: what was the something very extraordinary that happened during those crucial 10 years? Luckily for us, it happens that Cavafy would sometimes rewrite and republish a poem that he had previously published, so that we can examine both versions. the difference between the early work and its later incarnation opens a wonderful window into his creative process. The transformation of one poem in particular gives us a glimpse of something very extraordinary. Here is an 1894 poem called Sweet Voices.
Those voices are the sweeter which have fallen forever silent, mournfully resounding only in the heart that sorrows. In dreams the melancholic voices come, timorous and humble, and bring before our feeble memory the precious dead, whom the cold, cold earth conceals, for whom the mirthful daybreak never shines, nor springtime's blossom. Melodious voices sigh, and in the soul our life's first poetry sounds, like music in the night that's far away.
Cavafy composed this verse in 1893 at the age of 30 and published it a year later. There's no doubt that it's a lovely, moody thing, with the lilting assonances and end rhymes which I've tried to convey in my translation: mournfully fallen, come humble, earth mirthful, and with its seductive array of modifiers as pastel and sticky sweet as a plate of la durée macaron, sweet, mournful, melancholic, timorous, humble, feeble, precious, cold, cold, mirthful, melodious. What has to happen to turn a perfectly charming lyric about sorrow into a great poem about death? In a word, death itself. Between the late 1880s and the time he wrote that poem, death had begun its flirtation with Constantin Cavafy. His two oldest friends died in the late 1880s, both in their 20s still, and his brother Peter was dead already in 1891, also young. But between the 1890s and the early 1900s, death stalked the poet's family like a crazed lover. His grandfather died, a favorite uncle died, his mother died in 1899, his brother George was dead in 1900, his brother Aristides in 1902. Which is to say that by 1903, when Cavafy turned 40 and turned his attention once again to the poem you've just heard, death had taken most of his family and closest friends. Can we really wonder that in the same year, Cavafy was subjecting all of his previously published work to a stringent examination that he called the philosophical scrutiny, determined to strip from his verse what he impatiently referred to as flagrant inconsistencies, illogical possibilities, ridiculous exaggeration, just as death had stripped so much from him? Can we help speculating that as that crucial decade of his 30s wore on, years when he had to wait until his mother was asleep after dinner so that he might sneak out of the house at night to seek pleasure in the arms of other men, the inconsistencies, the unbearable illogic, the ridiculous falsehoods that he sought to expunge were not the only ones that he saw in his verse? We cannot, of course, ever really know, but what we can see, thanks to the window opened by his rewriting of Sweet Voices in 1903 and by his republication of it the following year under a slightly modified title, what we can see is a poet who has learned to lose things, a poet who has learned how to trust himself. The revised version of Sweet Voices is called simply Voices. And indeed, just as the adjective sweet has disappeared from the title, so too did Cavafy ruthlessly cut every single adjective from the poem itself. These elisions tell you everything you need to know about what a poet had come to understand about the sorrows and the gifts that the dead really do leave us.
Imagined voices and beloved too, all those who died, or of those who are lost unto us like the dead, Sometimes in our dreams they speak to us. Sometimes in its thought the mind will hear them. And with their sound, for a moment, their return sounds from the first poetry of our life, like music in the night, far off, that fades away.
The only two modifiers in this version are the only ones that count in the end when we think about our dead: imagined and beloved. This is a great poem. Like the poem, so too was the process Constantine Cavafy had to undergo in order to write it. Something very extraordinary. Thank you.
We love poets for the things their poems lead us to imagine. But equally, we love them for how we imagine their lives to be. Confusing the poets' lives with their work is an illusion as old as the tradition of confusing words with objects. But in fact, it is for the sake of this illusion that we feel such a strong need for poetry, for novels, for literature. There are some poets whose work we read with their life in mind, and what we know of that life ensures that their poetry leaves a more enduring impression. Cavafy is for me just such a poet. Like Edgar Allan Poe, like Franz Kafka, his best and most memorable work makes no explicit reference to himself. And yet, with every poem we read, we cannot help but think of him. I think of him as an old man wandering the familiar streets of an aging city. I think of him as a lover of books living as a member of a minority within a minority. I think of him as a lonely provincial man who is fully aware of his provinciality and who turns that knowledge into a kind of wisdom. Cavafy was born in Alexandria in 1863 to a Greek family of wealthy drapers and cloth merchants. The word kavaf, now forgotten even by the Turks themselves, is an Ottoman Turkish word for cheap shoes. The Cavafys were originally from Istanbul's Fener neighborhood, where the city's rich and politically influential Greek families lived. Later, they moved to Samatya, a fisherman's neighborhood, and then immigrated to Alexandria, where they lived as members of the Christian Orthodox minority among the Muslim majority. In Alexandria, a wealthy Greek family with many children, looked after by the English nannies. In his beloved Istanbul, age 19, the first stirrings of homoerotic desire. In Egypt, Arab nationalism, uprisings, bankruptcies, conflicts, migration to Europe, to Liverpool, and the impoverished families returned to Alexandria, to the very city Cavafy had wanted to leave behind. The return is the saddest part. It is the source of the sorrow which permeates his unforgettable poem, City, which I have read again and again in Turkish and English translations. There is no other city to go to. The city that makes us is the one within us. Reading Cavafy's City has changed the way I look at my own Istanbul. For those who lead a provincial life, life and happiness are always to be found elsewhere, in another country, in another city. In his poems, he says, in another sea. But for us, provincials, this other place is perpetually out of reach. Cavafy's wisdom is in the dignity and introspective sensibility with which he approaches this sad truth. And finally, with the same linguistic restraint and philosophical simplicity, he concludes by revealing that we have wasted our lives in that city. We come to realize that we have all been wasting our lives and that the problem lies not in being provincial, but in the very nature of life itself. Great poets can tell their own story without once saying I, and in doing so, lend their voice to all of humanity. Kierkegaard once said that the unhappy person lives either in the past or in the future. There are many old men in Cavafy's poems. Not trusting in the future is, for him, another kind of wisdom. So he fashions for himself a new past, one based on books, history, and ancient Greek mythology. Some of the narrative poems he based on the myths of ancient Greece are so intense and powerful that reading them feels like reading a particularly eventful novel. I was in Alexandria a year before the events now known as the Arab Spring began. I went to visit Cavafy's house, which has been turned into a museum. His actual family home was destroyed by British cannons. They'd used a different house for the museum. It was a Friday. Everyone was at the mosque for Friday prayers. The pavements were empty. The only people in the museum were tourists, the shuttered shops, the handful of old pine trees, the rundown buildings, the narrow streets, the squares, all helped me realize that versions of Istanbul of my childhood still survive in cities all over the Mediterranean. I love Cavafy's poetry, not just as a reflection of his exemplary life, but also for the landscape it depicts, for its crumbling buildings, and because I immediately identified with the texture of Mediterranean life. Every now and then, I reread some of Cavafy's collected poems, all of which fit comfortably in a slim volume. A longtime friend once published a selection of Cavafy's poetry in Turkish, working from Edmund Creeley's translations under the title, Waiting for the Barbarians. For many years thereafter, whenever we met, we greeted each other with the same joke, how are you? Oh, you know, waiting for the barbarians. What we meant was that, from a political perspective, we were, as usual, expecting even darker days ahead. Those darker days did actually come, and after the nationalist uprisings in Egypt, Alexandria's Greek minority abandoned the city altogether. But the final twist in this brilliant, story-like poem suggests an entirely different ending. Cavafy will never cease to surprise and move his readers.
You said, I'll go to some other land. I'll go to some other sea. There's bound to be another city that's better by far. My every effort has been ill-fated from the start. My heart, like something dead, lies buried away. How long will my mind endure this slow decay? Wherever I look, wherever I cast my eyes, I see all round me the black rubble of my life, where I've spent so many ruined and wasted years. You'll find no new places. You won't find other shores. The city will follow you. The streets in which you pace will be the same. You'll haunt the same familiar places, and inside those same houses, you'll grow old. You'll always end up in this city. Don't bother to hope for a ship, a route to take you somewhere else. They don't exist. Just as you've destroyed your life here in this small corner, so you've wasted it through all the world.
The Alexandria that Constantine Cavafy knew no longer exists, nor does the Alexandria that E.M. Forster knew during the First World War, nor the Alexandria that Lawrence Durrell spent time in during the Second World War, nor, for that matter, does the Alexandria I knew growing up in the late 50s and early 60s. These Alexandrias no longer exist. Something else lies on Egypt's Mediterranean coastline, but it's not Alexandria. E.M. Forster, the author of the one and only guidebook to Alexandria, lost his way in the streets of Alexandria when he returned before writing the third preface. Durrell might have gotten lost down its sinister lanes, but he certainly wouldn't recognize the Alexandria of the quartet one bit, and for good reason. His Alexandria never really existed in the first place. As for me, I could still take a walk in Alexandria today and never get lost. But the character of Alexandria has so thoroughly changed in the decades I've been away that what I found there when I finally went back unhinged me completely. This was not the place I'd come looking for. Whatever this was, it was not Alexandria. Where today's Alexandria is headed is anyone's guess, though I shudder to speculate, and certainly not in public. Cavafy, the ultimate Alexandrian, gave us an Alexandria that disappears before our eyes. The apartment where he made love as a young man is an office now, and the days of 1896, of 1901, and 1911 are no more. Everyone knows that the barbarians, like time itself, are at the gates, and that everything will be swept in their wake. They may come now, or in 1 or 2 centuries, or in 1,000 years, but come they will, and more than once, while you are landlocked in the city and cannot leave and cannot tear out the city, which is both your transitional home and your permanent demon, you cannot drive out. You and the city are one and the same, and soon neither will exist. As for the old Alexandria of Alexander the Great, of the Ptolemies, of Caesar and Cleopatra, of Callimachus, of Apollonius, of Philo, and of Plotinus, and let's not forget, of course, the Alexandria of the Great Library, well, it perished many times over, and from the evidence available today, never even existed. Stones and shards, scraps of paper and papyrus and fragments. Their Alexandria, like Cavafy's Alexandrias, or like mine, just happens to have been in Alexandria, and strange to say, happens to be called Alexandria too. And coincidentally enough, some of its streets still run along the same lines that the founders of the city laid down more than 2,000 years ago. But it's not Alexandria. There have been many Alexandrias, Egyptian, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, almost all totally pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious, multilingual, multi-everything. Or, in the unforgettable words of Lawrence Durrell again, in one of his more whimsical moments, a city of 5 races, 5 fleets, and more than 5 sexes. Which he also branded a moribund and spiritless backwater, a shabby little seaport built upon a sand reef. But Alexandria is more than a place, more than an imbrication of layers and tiers, more than an idea, and certainly more than just a metaphor. Alexandria is an invention. It is totally man-made, artificial, the way St. Petersburg is entirely man-made and therefore unnatural. A man-made city does not sprout. It is pulled out of sludge and shaken into existence. Because it is grafted, it never feels secure in one place, never belongs. It is on borrowed time, and the ground on which it's built comes from borrowed landfills, which is why, perhaps, it is splendiferous and extravagant. To forget it's on shaky ground, for nothing binds it to earth. You cannot swear on the ground you stand on, because the ground you stand on was never divinely yours, which may be why no one has convictions in Alexandria, and an oath, like truth, is always shifty business. Alexandria borrows belief systems and robs traditions from its neighbors, because it has none of its own to pass on, though it is almost always perfecting the things it adopts, because it lives off reinvention. Under the Ptolemies, it stole every book it could, and the way it appropriated and then promoted their knowledge it found in them. It borrowed nationalities, borrowed workers, borrowed legacies, borrowed languages, borrowed, but never one thing in one place, which is why it is the only spot in the history of mankind that not only understands but prescribes paradox in its charters. It won't be shocked when church and brothel share the same roof. The way it knows that the prophet and the street hustler are not just easy bedfellows. They are one and the same person. Wealth, pleasure, intellect, and God. That's what Alexandria adds up to. Or in the words of W.H. Auden about Cavafy, love, art, and politics. How these three cohabit without tearing each other apart is explained by one word only: genius. And genius never lasts. Like the library, which burned down many times over, like Hypatia, who died of 1,000 cuts, it never lasts, it cannot last. Which is why all Alexandrians have permanent homes elsewhere, hold 2 nationalities, and boast at least 3 mother tongues. And as for the sexes, I'll let somebody else take a guess. This was true in antiquity, and it was true in the last century. Alexandria is provisional in every sense of the word, the way truth is provisional, home is provisional, pleasure, and of course, love are provisional. There is no other way. Those who believe Alexandria is here to stay are not Alexandrians. They are the barbarians. Alexandria is unreal. You watch it disappear. You know it will. You wait for this. You anticipate the future and already know you'll remember you anticipated it when that future comes. There is no present tense in Alexandria. The covenants of times were always broken here. However you look at things, everything always already happened, will happen, might, could, should, may never happen. Totally counterfactual. The ancient called this the IRREALIS mood, part conditional, part subjunctive, part nothing. You fantasize the way you remember a might-have-been life that hasn't really happened, but isn't unreal for not happening, and might still happen, though you fear it already has, but really never did. When Cavafy steps into the room of his younger days, he is neither here nor there. He watches the cast of the afternoon sun upon the bed that was once there, and he knows he already knew, even back then, that he'd think of this one dear moment many, many years later. This is, this was, this will always be the real Alexandria.
Most of us have an understanding of the life and death of the great library of Alexandria. Many of us feel we have an intimate connection with its history. It is deeply ingrained as an element of our historical understanding of Western civilization. I must admit, I remain frustrated by the loss of this great library, as perhaps you do, so I suppose we're all history fans. My connection with this library, though, starts in a rather unlikely place, with President Richard Milhous Nixon. Although the personality of Richard Nixon may not have seemed very enlightened, he was in fact very well read when it came to world history. In fact, after he participated in the negotiations for the Egyptian-Israeli peace accords, he chose to visit Egypt, partly to satisfy his desire to see the great monuments there. At the Cairo airport, he was informed by President Sadat of his organized visit to the pyramids that he looked so forward to seeing. While the Nixons and the Sadats visited the pyramids, and I must point out that this is literally only 2 months before Nixon's resignation as president, the Watergate scandals, 1974. Nixon discussed the upcoming tour of Alexandria, and he then reportedly asked if there would be any opportunity to visit the site of the great Alexandria Library. Everyone looked shocked because no one knew how to respond. No one knew where the great Alexandria Library once stood. The president asked his aides, and they had no response, and so there was utter confusion. Nixon and Sadat, though, eventually went to Alexandria, and they did not visit the great library site. It was gone. But the trip to Alexandria became one of the most iconic moments of President Nixon's visit to Egypt. In fact, it became the subject of a front page of Time magazine. Nixon and Sadat went to Alexandria for one purpose, but their purpose changed. Interestingly, accompanying Sadat on this trip was the then General Hosni Mubarak. This set in play a seed that lasted over 20 years to not only find the site of the ancient library, but revive the idea of the Great Library of Alexandria. For many years, there was considerable discussion as to where the site might be and what the new library might be. It was, of course, a Hellenistic invention in many ways. It was not Pharaonic, as most people somehow assumed. And in 1989, there was held a great international competition, architectural competition, for which my company participated. Over 500 entries were reviewed from 70 countries. And somehow, at the age of 28, all of us were under the age of 30, we won, which was rather much of a shock. As we studied to create the design, we discovered the words of Cavafy. I'd heard of Cavafy in the past, but his world opened our minds to Alexandria that was so ephemeral, an Alexandria that changed and that was filled with life and death. Of course, we began to recognize the archaic histories of Alexandria and all the things that had led to this great library in this well-known part of our imagination. As I took a walk on the site after they pulled the topsoil off the ground, this is what I saw. I walked on the bones of the history of 2,000 years of the dead. Pottery shards from all of those layers of history were exposed for the first time, and with every step I took, I could feel the crunch of all of that death beneath my feet. But at the same time, we began to recover and find new things on the site. This was one of the most beautiful findings. It's a Roman mosaic that was discovered on the side of this beautiful dog and probably a wealthy person's home. Out in the harbor of Alexandria, archaeological expeditions uncovered many beautiful artifacts. This is perhaps the most beautiful, Isis, and she's made of basalt. And if you look so closely there, you can see how transparent her gown is, despite the fact that it's made of millions of years of stone. Alexandria sits in a very unusual place between the life of the Mediterranean and the death of the Sahara. It draws this line rather completely as you move through the city. And around the city is an enormous kind of character of this great natural harbor that exists, the great harbor of Alexandria. This harbor existed some 17,000 years before Cavafy was even born. The red circle there is where Cleopatra's Palace of the Muses once stood, and the blue circle in the foreground is where the great lighthouse of Alexandria stood. And this fantastic circular harbor it defines in very many ways this very unusual city. As you move around the harbor, you begin to imagine geometries and histories and narratives of the past that relate us to this circular geometry. Ra, the great sun god. We see the eyes of Cavafy in his round spectacles in this great harbor. And we see things like computer chips that are part of our contemporary technology. All of these geometries are linked. So our plan for this great library was to unite this cylindrical geometry into a form that could house a new library, a new reading room, and a new series of areas that could allow people to study once again in Alexandria. We know the circle very well because it, of course, represents the earth that we stand on. Although spherical and although round, it is deeply ingrained in our minds that we occupy this place of cylindrical continuity. But of course, we don't see the world this way. We see the world flat. We see it as a horizon. And that horizon divides the sky from the earth. It divides the past from the future. And of course, the ground we walk on is the present. So our building is, in a sense, a definition of that sense of time. We rotated the section of the building, we pushed it into the ground and rose it up to the sky so that it dives into the past, rises into the future, and rotates about the present, the only thing that we can define in any clear way. So the building is a picture of a moment through time, and there is the building as it was built. It has a character which sets itself aside from the chaos of Alexandria. It's clear and it's identifiable, and its reaction, its very simple geometry, responds to something that we all understand, no matter what culture we come from. It rises toward the European continent, toward the Hellenistic roots that it had. And in a sense, as it lifts itself up, it faces the Sahara in a very stalwart way. As you look up the roof of this building, it's 160 meters in diameter, and the roof leads you to the sky, to the clouds, and the clouds become a form of landscape. Across this roof, across this character, as it cuts this diagonal, we see the city sliced in half. As the sun sets in the evening, there's a very gentle pool of water that helps cool the qualities of atmosphere around the building as you enter it. And at night, its lights change its character. It almost becomes a sun or a moon at night. The great walls that face the Sahara are made of granite, and that granite was inspired by the Rosetta Stone itself, which in some ways represents geologic time of language, as if language had existed for millennia, millions of years. And as you pass your eyes across the stone, you're reading 10,000 years of language from many different roots. I believe we had 500 roots of language here, including mathematics, musical notation. Each of these tall stones that you see is 6 feet high, and they rise right up to the sky. To find the stone, we uncovered a quarry in the south of Egypt. This quarry had been dead for 600 years, and we brought it back to life to build the granite for this, to bring the granite for this library. We discovered when we uncovered this quarry that in fact it was the same quarry that the stones of Karnak were taken from. So on the left, the stones of Karnak, on the right, the Alexandria Library. There's 5,000 years of history between these two walls, and they came from about 100 yards apart. As you enter the building, there's a very unassuming doorway. You pass through the doorway and you begin to be reminded of spaces that we see commonly in Arabic Egypt. And those spaces allow themselves to be translated and interpreted in a contemporary way. There's a balcony that you enter, and from this balcony you can see all of the levels. There are room for 3,500 people to read in this library and over 5 million books. As you rise up these various terraces, there's great rooms at the top where up to 60 or 70 people can sit in dialogue with one another. And as you look down, you get the urban plan of the library itself. It's as if the library were a city rather than a room with furniture, bookshelves, and chairs. The columns themselves remind us a bit of ancient history, and of course they bring light into the room in a very unique way. And the roof is all about allowing the sun and natural light to enter the space. And finally, the chairs that we've created have a context that also tell us about what we're reminded of in ancient Egypt, Pharaonic Egypt, which in a sense has nothing to do with the great library. We worked on this for 13 years. It took us 13 years to build this thing, and it was a rather astonishing. I lost all my hair, unlike Alexander the Great. We did all of that. While we worked on this library, many things happened from 1989 forward. The Soviet Union fell. The Berlin Wall fell. There were peace accords. The Oslo peace accords were understood. The Lebanese Civil War came to an end. Everything seemed great. And about a year before the opening of the library, we set the date, and it was set for October 11th, 2001, and it just seemed like a great day until this happened. 1 month before the opening of the Great Library of Alexandria, the World Trade Centers were attacked, and there was no opening. It all had to be canceled. Nobody would go to Egypt. This followed by incredible chaos in the world, geopolitical chaos, which further delayed the opening of the building. Yet still, while it existed, people used it. And there were some 10,000 visitors a day, every day, using this library, despite the fact that it hadn't actually opened officially. Suddenly, this time passed. January 25th, 2011 occurred, which is the great uprisings in Egypt. These were the first pictures that we received from Egypt. That is the site of the Great Library of Alexandria, just to the left of these fires. We were certain that the Great Library would burn once again. It didn't seem to have a future. So fearful of the loss of the library, we received these images. People were protesting around it continuously, and we thought certainly it would be damaged. And then we received this picture, which was rather astonishing. The people of Alexandria, the citizens of the university, had formed a human chain around the library to protect it from damage, to allow it to continue to operate and to be a place for peaceful dialogue. It was used for a site of prayer. These were both pro-government and anti-government forces protecting the power of the word that existed in this library. It had matured. After the revolts had subsided, it still has about 5,000 to 6,000 visitors a day. They've opened a new children's library inside of the Great Library of Alexandria. This is a wonderful picture of a woman taking a picture. And still, I find this as a way of seeing the future of this building. So I just want to stop by saying that as I read Cavafy's words, once again, after all of this time has passed, I don't see things, I see people. And these are all of the, as every person that I meet, everywhere that I go, I look into their eyes and I see a story that somehow leads to these great poems that Cavafy has given us to allow us to understand how life and knowledge are so closely intertwined. And so it's come full circle. This is the library as it is today. 17,000 years have passed since this harbor began, and today still people row out without motors to catch fish. In full cycle, strangely enough, I came to New York because I'm now working on as the architect for the design of the Memorial Museum at the World Trade Center site, the same destruction that delayed the opening of the Alexandria Library, and I see somehow this circle as a big part of my life. Thank you.
He went inside the cafe where they used to go together. It was here, 3 months ago, that his friend had told him, "We're completely broke, the two of us so poor. We're down to sitting in the cheapest places. I have to tell you, straight out, I can't go around with you anymore. I want you to know, somebody else is after me." The somebody else had promised him 2 suits, some silk handkerchiefs. To get his friend back, he himself went through hell, rounding up 20 pounds. His friend came back to him for the 20 pounds. But along with that, for their old intimacy, their old love, for the deep feeling between them, the somebody else was a liar, a real bum. He'd ordered only 1 suit for his friend, that under pressure, after much begging. But now he doesn't want suits any longer. He doesn't want the silk handkerchiefs at all, or 20 pounds, or 20 piastres. Sunday, they buried him. At 10 in the morning, Sunday, they buried him almost a week ago. He laid flowers on his cheap coffin, lovely white flowers, very much in keeping with his beauty, his 22 years. When he went to the cafe that evening, he happened to have some vital business there. That same cafe where they used to go together, it was a knife in his heart. That dingy cafe where they used to go together.
of the early 20th century's greatest artists begin with fundamentally the same problem. What are we to make of lost time? If memory is all that can be kept of the past, how might it be kept alive? And if there is no life beyond this one, can the art we make of memory become our survival, the continuing trace of our presence in the world? C.P. Cavafy and Marcel Proust stand at the beginning of the era in which we understood that time and space were relative, and new modes of travel and communication blurred our sense of the fixity of either. These writers could not be more opposite in their methods. Proust is the ultimate maximalist, his vast novel a record of a consciousness that seems to hover and dart like a dragonfly, attentive to every nuance. He wants to make a book that feels as huge and various as experience itself. But Cavafy is dedicated to austerity. His brief, often aching poems are sometimes just a handful of lines and never more than 2 pages. His poems refuse figurative speech. Almost nothing is like anything else. Many a line goes unadorned by adjectives or adverbs, these bare narratives and assertions, seemingly all this poet will allow himself. And yet a reader can hardly miss the tremendous pressure the poet has placed on each short lyric and the way this almost elemental, dry, hard-won language bears that weight. Here is Cavafy's shortest poem. It seems to me to describe the whole of his poetic project, and it seems an equally apt distillation of Proust's grand novel as well. Ready for À la recherche du temps perdu in 5 lines? Here it is, in Edmund Keeley's translation. In the same space. The setting of houses, cafes, the neighborhood that I've seen and walked through years on end. I created you while I was happy, while I was sad, with so many incidents, so many details. And for me, the whole of you has been transformed into feeling. This is the work of these 2 writers, to bring the world so completely into the self that it is both preserved and recast, held in memory and in art, given back to the reader in a form that makes us feel miraculous, that our lives are reflected there. It is not coincidental that both writers were men who loved other men. The notion of same-sex love as a relation between equals, with a possibility of sustained coupling over time, an idea very clear to us when 14 states allow gay couples to marry, was pretty unthinkable in France or Egypt early in the 20th century. Homosexual love was most often something fleeting, a charged encounter given potency by the pressures against it, the law of social disapproval, the family, the church. Every erotic joy comes with an equal measure of loss, for no pleasure will be sustained. For Cavafy, poetry becomes a hedge against this erasure, a kind of erotic snapshot, something to keep. Now, to write about sex in a way that is neither pornographic, euphemistic, or clinical is challenge enough. But Cavafy is also making homosexual sex legible to an audience without the experience to read it, defending that behavior and imagining a future in which it will no longer be prescribed. I want to read to you one of the most daring of Cavafy's erotic poems, one in which, characteristically, there is no actual sex at all, but rather anticipation and aftermath. This is The Bandaged Shoulder in Daniel Mendelsohn's translation. He said that he'd hit a wall, or that he'd fallen, but probably there was another reason for the wounded, bandaged shoulder. With a rather forceful motion, so he could take down from a shelf some photographs that he wanted to see close up, the bandage came undone, and a little blood flowed. I bound the shoulder up again, and over the binding, I lingered somewhat, for he wasn't in pain, and I liked looking at the blood. Matter of my love is what that blood was. When he left, I found, in front of the chair, a bloodied scrap of cloth, part of the bandage, a scrap that looked like it should go straight into the trash, and which I took upon my lips, and which I kept for a long while, the blood of love upon my lips. That scrap of bandage is a love token and a piece of trash. The man who brings it to his lips is both devoted and desperate. The poem ends not with the blood of my love, but the blood of love upon my lips. What can be kept of love? Souvenir, detritus, precious relic? This is the earliest text I know of gay shame, but it is also any lover's debasement. Who hasn't known that moment of abjection when we do anything just to touch some element of the beloved again? It is an extraordinarily tense, discomfiting poem, an engine of joy and abasement, not more beautiful than desolate, not more painful than tender. Now, even casual readers of Cavafy know that his poems do not occupy just the personal past, but also look backward toward a whole Hellenist history. He seems as at home in the Alexandria of the first century as in that same city 1,800 years later. He writes about the citizens of distant times as though he were gossiping about friends, and speaks with confident ease to generals and conquerors and kings. If a poem can encapsulate a moment 30 years old and make it available now, why not a moment 1,000 years old? There is a sense running through Cavafy's work that we are less individuals than citizens of culture, expressions of the cities that shape us. The prohibitions that rankle a 20th century lover are equally the business of the 2nd century one. We still blame barbarians for our problems, still imagine the goal at the end of the journey to Ithaca to be the point of that journey. These continuities mark us as members of a tribe. When we read a Cavafy poem, we understand that the poet is speaking to his particular situation, the struggles and pleasures of a life. But almost at the same moment comes the sense that these poems are ours. How a poet does this, making the least moment a common human one, is a mystery that resists illumination. Antony receives these unforgettable instructions at the moment of his abandonment. Listen, your final delectation, to the voices, to the exquisite music of that strange procession, and say goodbye to her, the Alexandria you are losing. We will, every one of us, lose the cities we love. The passing music, the unrepeatable processions we have been a part of, those will go on without us. But how lucky we are to have words like these, with their firm cadences, their nobility, their wounded and radiant honesty. Words like these to go with us.
When suddenly, at midnight, there comes the sound of an invisible procession passing by, with exquisite music playing, with voices raised. Your good fortune, which now gives away all your efforts' ill-starred outcome, the plans you made for life, which turned out wrong. Don't mourn them uselessly, like one who's long prepared, like someone brave. Bid farewell to her, to Alexandria, who is leaving. Above all, do not fool yourself. Don't say that it was a dream, that your ears deceived you. Don't stoop to futile hopes like these. Like one who's long prepared, like someone brave, as befits a man who's been blessed with a city like this, go without faltering toward the window and listen with deep emotion, but not with the entreaties and the whining of a crowd. Listen to the sounds of final entertainment, to the exquisite instruments of that initiate crew, and bid farewell to her, to Alexandria, whom you are losing.
It would be normal to assume that a translator is intimately familiar with both the language to be translated and the target language. And Cavafy has been generally fortunate over the years to have had translators of his Greek into English who appear to have known both languages reasonably well. Yet the curious fact is that a crucial line in one of his most important and popular poems, the one we just heard, Απολείπων ο Θεός Αντώνιον, which is usually rendered as the God abandons Antony, has never come out quite as it should have in English. The line I have in mind is «Σαν που ταιριάζει σε που αξιώθηκες μια τέτοια πόλη». Why is it a crucial line? In the poem, we hear the poet's persona telling the great Roman Antony what his stance should be as he listens to the music of the invisible procession that marks the departure of his god after the defeat at Actium. Not the gods of the poem's sources, Heracles and Dionysus, but the city of Alexandria, as Cavafy understood that city. And the persona makes clear that Antony's stance should be in keeping with what a citizen of Cavafy's Alexandria will have learned: to see things as they are without illusions, to face failing luck courageously, to honor the passionate life. What the line in question tells us is that Antony should listen to the passing music and voices of the strange procession signaling his death in a way that is right for someone who has proven worthy of the kind of city he's about to lose. A city of sensual pleasure and devotion to art that offers him the final pleasures of this exquisite music as it passes out of his life. It is the verb axiothikes that is problematic in all the English versions, the Keeley Sherrard version included. The many translators who choose to translate the verb attached to Antony as are worthy or was worthy or simply worthy seem to have the verb axizes in mind, perhaps recognizing the Roman stature, but not what the poem implies about all that the triple pillar of the world has come to know and celebrate in Alexandria. Valasopoulos sets the tone in the first published translation of the poem with his, quote, like a man who was worthy of such a city, end quote. But worthy when? Presumably not on Antony's arrival in the city, at least not until he had, that is, the city had taught him the virtue of its particular pleasures. John Cavafy's, that's Cavafy's brother, his early version with his, quote, you who gained this city, for se pou axiothikes, comes closer to the poem's pulse than was worthy, as does the recent Sachperoglu version, quote, you who were deemed worthy. But these phrases don't suggest how gained or who deemed. When the point is that Cavafy's persona and his vision of Alexandria are bringing Antony his final recognition of what he has learned and for what he has learned. And Daniel Mendelsohn, my dear friends, very recent, blessed with a city like this, appealing as it is, also seems to me to introduce a somewhat inappropriate biblical overtone, but I'm willing to change my mind. Finally, those who tell us that Antony deserves the city he's losing, or such a city is his due, avoid the nuance of the Romans having come to see at least something of what the god Alexandria represents and having thereby earned his citizenship in Cavafy city. The English versions of the concluding phrase in the line "Mia techa poli," which we find usually rendered as such a city, or even so great a city, too easily limit the more complex implications of this kind of city that would be amply dramatized as Cavafy moved forward from this crucial year of 1910 that my friend Daniel Mendelsohn outlined earlier. 1910, when he began to establish the full dimensions of the mythical city that was to be his preoccupation from this date until his death 23 years later. The line we've extracted, and especially the verb axiothikos, tell us that in the end, Roman Antony proved worthy of this kind of city that the Greek poet Cavafy was now engaged in creating with the full devotion, courage, and wisdom of his mature life. So, how about, quote, you who proved worthy of this kind of city, end quote, for Cavafy's richly loaded Greek line? Maybe that's the best we can do. Thank you.
In the entrance hallway of that sumptuous home, there was an enormous mirror, very old, acquired at least 80 years ago. A strikingly beautiful boy, a tailor's assistant, on Sunday afternoons an amateur athlete, was standing with a package. He handed it to one of the household, who then went back inside to fetch a receipt. The tailor's assistant remained alone and waited. He drew near the mirror, stood gazing at himself. He straightened his tie. 5 minutes later, they brought him the receipt. He took it and left. But the ancient mirror, which had seen and seen again throughout its lifetime of so many years, thousands of objects and faces, but the ancient mirror now became elated, inflated with pride, because it had received upon itself perfect beauty for a few minutes.
Η θάλασσα στα βάθη της πήρε έναν αυτή. Η μάνα του ανήξερε πιένει για ναυτή. Στην Παναγιά μπροστά υψηλό κερί. Για να επιστρέψει γρήγορα και έναν καλοκαίρι και όλο προς τον άνεμο στείνει ταυτή. Αλλά ενώ προσεύχεται και δέεται αυτή, εικόν ακούει σοβαρή και λυπημένη, ξεύροντας πως δεν θα έλθει πια ο Υιός
That year, he found himself without a job, and so he made a living from cards, from backgammon, and what he borrowed.
Το χρόνο εκείνο βρέθηκε χωρίς δουλειά και συνεπώς ζούσε από τα χαρτιά, από το τάβλι και τα δανεικά.
A job at £3 a month at a little stationer's had been offered to him, but he turned it down without the slightest hesitation. It wouldn't do. It wasn't a wage for him, for a young man with some education, 25 years of age.
Μια θέση 3 λιρών το μήνα σε μικρό χαρτοπολείο του είχε προσφερθεί. Μα την αρνήθηκε χωρίς κανένα δισταγμό. Δεν έκανε, δεν ήτανε μισθός για αυτόν. Νέον με γράμματα αρκετά και 25 ετών.
2 or 3 shillings a day was what he'd get.
2-3 σελήνια
Sometimes not. I mean, what could the boy possibly earn from cards and backgammon in the coffee houses of his class, the common ones? However cleverly he played, however stupid the partners he chose. And loans? Well, then there were those loans. It was rare that he managed a crown. More often it was half. Sometimes he'd settle for shillings.
Sometimes for a week, occasionally more. When he was spared the hour, the horror of staying up till dawn, he'd cool off at the baths, have a swim in the morning.
His clothes were in a dreadful state. There was one suit that he would always wear, a suit of very faded cinnamon hue.
Oh, days of the summer of 1908. Your vision, quite exquisitely, was spared that very faded cinnamon-colored suit.
Your vision preserved him as he was when he undressed, when he flung off the unworthy clothes and the mended underwear, and he'd be left completely nude, flawlessly beautiful, a thing of wonder, his hair uncombed, springing back, his limbs a little colored by the sun from his nakedness in the morning at the baths and at the seashore.
despairing nights, when the vision goes and leaves me all alone. How it departs and melts away. The trees go, the streets go, the houses go.